McGill community were shocked and angered at the intervention of riot police on campus last Thursday, November 10th. These events raised fundamental questions regarding academic freedom and the nature of the university. The goal of this roundtable is to bring historical and international perspectives to the dialogue surrounding the issue and to allow members of the community to discuss and debate these issues. So without further ado,
I'll start first of all by saying that I'm in solidarity and congratulations with those who occupied both the 5th and 2nd floors of the James Administration Building, as well as those who defended their comrades on the outside. So not simply those who are sitting down and locking arms, but those who are fighting back, which I think is a good place to start from. In the Canadian context, we don't have a history of asylum on university campuses, such as my colleagues are also going to speak about. In fact, in Canada, police, both repression and infiltration, have been a constant presence on campuses throughout Canadian history. So we can think about the 1930s with kind of Red Scare, communist baiting during the Depression. Actually, McGill was quite a hotbed of young communist organizing, and consequently the police infiltrated like crazy, which they do by joining all kinds of silly student clubs and debating societies and whatnot because they thought this was the center of the revolution. Of course, in the 1960s, similar to the US context, perhaps not quite as drastic in as much as nobody was assassinated by police forces. There was a series of repressions. We can think about McGill, and in Quebec, the list is very long of places where the police came on campus and beat up students, but also across the country, especially notably in places like Simon Fraser in Vancouver is a quite bloody history. And then we can even think of more recent examples such as the APEC demonstrations in 1997, police interventions at UBC, even just a couple of years ago, 12 students arrested at the University of Toronto for occupying the principal's office. So this is not an aberration. So today I'll be speaking specifically, though, about the Montreal context, a little bit about Quebec, but more specifically Montreal, trying to touch briefly on several things about this moment at McGill that seem to me to be striking within the context of that broader history, both recent and less recent. I would start by saying that I am angered but not shocked by the police intervention here last Thursday. Actually, in Quebec, there is a constant battle on campuses between students who are resisting and police whose job it is, in fact, they weren't acting outside of their mandate, but whose job it is to repress social movements. Throughout the history of the student movement in Quebec, there are countless instances of this. In more recent years, we can think of in the fall of 2007, the Mardi de Matraque at the Cégep de Vieux, less sexily in English, like Billy Club Tuesday or something, in which there was an occupation there of the Cégep de Vieux Montréal, a massive police intervention, over 100 arrests. I personally witnessed a student being tasered. It was a nasty scene. At UQAM in the strike of 2007, 2008, we can think of riot cops escorting Administrator Claude Corbeau through the campus. It is, in fact, a constant reality of students on campuses fighting for accessible education in Quebec that the police intervene on campus. And I say this because I think I've been kind of paying attention in a way that I try not normally to do to things happening at McGill within the last week or so. And I think there is, in fact, a kind of a disturbing element of kind of privileged internal debate about the sanctity of our campus. This has been violated. We don't feel safe on our own campus. Why did this happen to us? So I think we have to ask ourselves realistically, why did this happen? Why does it happen in other places in Montreal and Quebec? It happens because campuses become effective sites of resistance. Where people are building movements, where people are contesting hegemonic discourse, where people are saying, hell no, we're not going to pay that much to go to school, that's crazy. And congratulations, at McGill, that happened last week. So people at McGill deserve to give themselves a round of applause for standing up and becoming an effective site of resistance. And when you do that, this is what happens. The police come. And it's disturbing, and it's traumatic, and oftentimes it's quite violent. But I think what we need to do here today is to celebrate students' defense of egalitarian concepts, and to celebrate the fact that they took action and they stood up for themselves and they fought back, and not get into this. I think there's a kind of like a sense of like privileged moral outrage. How did this happen on our campus? I don't feel safe on my campus. Certainly nobody should feel unsafe. Certainly we never want to have the police on our campus. We never want to have the police anywhere. But I think there needs to be more of an understanding that McGill is, in fact, this kind of privileged gated community already. And you put yourself in the situation of being attacked by the cops because you did something good. And when good things happen, bad people try to make them not happen. This is like a standard equation of social movements. Secondly, I've been watching like the coverage of the Senate debate. And I think there's a lot of rhetoric from the administration about this being a kind of I don't know, like this was a mistake that nobody saw coming. They called the normal cops and then the bad cops came. It's both confusing and a lie. And I think what I want to do is put it in the context of, I would say, roughly the last 10 years of student organizing at McGill, from about the war in Iraq on, in which case students organized heavily at that time for a one-day strike. And out of that, I came kind of having been one of those McGill activists, I don't want to like toot our horn, but we did a lot of stuff. We occupied stuff, we organized demonstrations, we disrupted meetings of the principal, we did blah, 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 and it was like at some points it was like 2 actions a week for like periods of 2 months. And when that happens, there is a kind of like escalation of response. And so every time McGill security would be like, we're gonna call the cops, and we would say, yeah, right. And so significantly it proceeded along the trajectory of we're gonna call the cops, yeah, right. Until in fact, they did start to call the cops as a kind of evolution in policy and response to an escalating series of student actions. So when the administration says, we don't know how this happened, we need an investigation, it's unclear to us how we ended up in this situation. I mean, it's possibly true, in which case, perhaps security didn't anticipate that the riot cops were going to come. Maybe, I mean, there were 30,000 people like half a kilometer away who were ready to do some whatever. I think it's like a pretty standard equation that something was going to happen. But it is in fact an evolution of policy which has brought us to this point in response to action. So I think that students on this campus need to hold their administrators to account and to have a bit of sense of their own history. And then I want to move more significantly to look at this moment in McGill's activism in the light of things that have happened on this campus and in the general context of the Montreal student movement within the last 40 years. So the date that's being thrown around a lot in the campus media by everybody concerned is 1969. So that this hasn't happened, and there hasn't been this kind of concerted police presence on campus since Opération McGill Français in March of 1969, in which effectively the campus became a militarized zone due to the massive demonstration that was to take place on a given March evening. I don't remember the exact date. And the military was on call and blah blah blah. And it was a a dangerous and frightening moment for student activists and activists of all sorts in Quebec, and was in fact a forerunner of the massive repression of October 1970, which would drastically change the face of the left in Quebec for the rest of all time. But I want to go just a couple months prior to that, to the fall semester of the year before, in 1968, in which there was an occupation of James administration by 30-odd students who were kind of doing it more, I would say, in like party time 1960s style than maybe the kind of like earnest 21st century moment that we saw last week. Like there was a lot more like hanging out and having fun in James Admin for a little while. But in fact, there was a massive police intervention and arrests and a whole series of disciplinary processes that 28 students had to go through. And there are things about that moment which are, I would say, kind of strikingly similar to what we see here happening now. Libération Populaire, like the popular wing of sorts of the FLQ. In fact, some of them maybe were perhaps involved in FLQ activity. And it was they who went on to operate, to do Opération Média Français in concert with elements of the Quebec student movement and the labor and sovereigntist movements. And the administration really, really effectively exploited that divide. In which they looked at the more radical left and they said, you're totally out of touch with what students generally want. This is kind of like this off-campus bullshit inflamed rhetoric, blah, blah. And I think actually there's a potential for that to happen in this moment. And the way that I think that it needs to be avoided right now is that there needs to be a very central importance placed on an analysis of the student movement that is integrated with other struggles. So I think we have seen that a bit, in the statement of the occupiers. We are in solidarity with people of color, indigenous people, queer struggles, migrant justice. But I think that there needs to be, beyond the kind of like knee-jerk anti-capitalism of the 99% rhetoric, a real integrated analysis which has an honest and self-critical perspective on the role that students can play, both in the Montreal community and in broader people's movements for liberation. But crucially, that people on the kind of more left edge of what's happening on campus need to recognize that, and this is like maybe a bit difficult for me to say, that the student community is actually a real community. That it's not just like totally privileged nonsense, that it is like a real community of interest with real accessibility concerns, but that these accessibility concerns need to be integrated into a broader sense of what are the barriers to being at university, and also I think a pretty frank analysis that actually access to post-secondary education, while it is an important issue, is like perhaps not the most pressing one for revolutionary movements in the 21st century. So, kind of an honest and frank assessment of what we're doing here. Another thing that I just want to point out briefly, and not being a McGill activist at the moment, people who are more involved, like, feel free to tell me to stick it in my pipe, or however you say that, if this is not true. But I think one thing that helped to divide the movement in the '69 context was a certain type of like particular rah-rah macho radicalism. Like students at that time, which is more characteristic of the '60s in general, so it should be put in context but still held to account. We're using language such as like the rape of Quebec, to talk about American foreign interest in Quebec. And into the 1970s, this was, I think, very alienating for students on campus who were not kind of bombastic white men, and divided the movement, in fact, into ways that were, productive and interesting ultimately in actually the foundation of many of the primary feminist struggles in Montreal's history, but really debilitated the movement at McGill in terms of moving forward in a coherent way. And I was at the assembly on Monday, and it was, as inspiring as it was to see something like that happen at McGill, which I personally would never have envisioned ever as a McGill student. That many people, standing up and opposing the police and, talking in a way that was militant. It also was a lot of men speaking, it's like time after time after time. And I also noticed that people of the people who wish to identify themselves as having occupied the James Administration building, it was all men. I'm not sure if there are other people who identify differently in the building, but I think this is something to take into account when we're moving forward. I'm probably running out of time, but I just want to say one last thing, that I think if we compare this current moment in the 21st century student organizing to things that happened in the 1960s, into the 70s, it's actually, there are some pretty fruitful comparisons to be made in the sense of students identifying with democratic uprisings in the global south, albeit of a much different character, you know, kind of guerrilla struggle versus the Arab Spring. The US and Canada waging imperial wars of aggression abroad, a student opposition to that. Obviously the economic context is much different. But I think from those similarities, we can look at what happened in the 60s and 70s and crucially avoid reinventing a kind of pretty basic wheel, which is that, again, students do constitute an actual community of interest with a basis for militant organizing. But they are, in fact, not a class, nor an oppressed social group. And that education is, in fact, while important, not the central concern in grassroots movements today. Students need to organize themselves for accessible education in a way that's militant, in a way that doesn't apologize, in a way that fights back both physically and otherwise against police repression. But in doing so, need to recognize the role that they should play within a movement, which is in fact, you know, one of support, one of solidarity, one of kind of comradeship. And that historically, they have done so most effectively when they've organized themselves, in Quebec at least, around the basis of student syndicalist principles. So, you know, the primary vehicle for this in Quebec at the moment is the AC, l'Association pour la Solidarité Syndicale Étudiante. So universities as, you know, actual sites of struggle, students as militantly organizing themselves on a union basis, and from this kind of collectively organized perspective, rather than the kind of individualist, consumer-based type of activism that I think, you know, we'd see in like Adbusters or whatever, that's inspiring the 99% in many places of the world, distressingly to me. From this basis, they can effectively integrate themselves into ongoing grassroots struggle in a way that is sustainable and ongoing and revolutionary. Thanks.
In Portuguese-speaking countries in the Americas, has a population today of about 500 million people. Today, this includes about 10 million students in universities and other post-secondary educations. In the last 2 decades, the number of university students in Latin America has grown enormously. In Chile, for example, from 1990 to 2011, the number of university students increased by 250%. 7 out of 10 of these students are the first generation in their families to go to university. Today, about 1 in 4 Latin Americans between the ages of 18 and 24 are university students, and there are quite a lot of older students as well. What I want to do now is to tell you about some of the most important student movements in Latin America over the past century. These are the Argentine University Reform Movement of 1918, the Mexican Student Movement of 1968, and 2 important student movements that are happening right now in Latin America, in Chile and in Colombia. First, the University Reform Movement in Argentina, 1918 to 1920. This influenced university students throughout Latin America. The Argentine student movement, which began in Córdoba and soon spread to Buenos Aires, was a movement of young middle-class men against the stifling, oligarchic, Catholic Church-ridden, patronage-ridden universities. This was a generational movement that was important because it established the model of university autonomy, which has been a major theme in Latin America ever since. University autonomy in Latin America means the government should not intervene in the governance or the curriculum of universities. Public universities are independent of the government, but they, of course, receive government funding. Also, the idea of autonomy implies that the police or the army should not come on campus unless they are summoned by the rector. although this often is not respected. But when it's not respected, it really makes students upset. Certainly, this idea that the army or the police should not come on campus was not respected during the military dictatorships of the 1960s and 70s. Finally, the Argentine University movement of 1918 asserted the right of students to be involved in university governance because they, these students said, are the people most concerned with the quality of their own educations. Indeed, since this time, both at the university level and within the faculties, governance in Latin American universities is by councils of elected representatives of the professors, students, and alumni, and sometimes representatives of the Ministry of Education. In Latin American universities, there is no equivalent of our Board of Governors, and there is no tradition of important business people playing a significant role in governing the university. Although connections between economy and education do shape the university system. The councils of professors, students, and alumni are intended to be democratic. The idea is that universities should be models of democratic governance for the larger society, and university rectors are elected by these councils. But one should not idealize these councils. In practice, there are often problems of patronage, personalistic networks, factionalism, etc. In Latin America, though, perhaps because those who make it to university are a certain intellectual elite, and also socioeconomic elite quite often, although this is changing. There is the sense that people connected to the university need to talk to and be in connection with the larger society. The generation of 18 in Argentina had a major impact on students in universities throughout Latin America. A second very important student movement took place 50 years later. This was the Mexican student movement of 1968, a crucial year of student mobilization in Paris and indeed around the world. Mexico at this time was governed by the PRI party that was the heir to the Mexican Revolution of 1910. This is the party by 1968 had been in power for 40 years. It was called itself a democratic one-party system, even a revolutionary one-party system. But in fact, it was pretty co-optive, and by this time it had become rather authoritarian. The student movement began with demands for university reforms and with street clashes with the police in late July of 1968, so a couple of months after May '68 in Paris. It soon evolved into a larger movement for the democratization of the university and also of the larger political system. The university movement attracted sympathy from quite a number of sectors of the wider population. Beyond the students, and high school students participated directly in the movement as well. There were violent encounters with the police and military on and off campus. And the Mexican government was particularly worried because for the first time in October of 1968, the Olympics were to be held in a country that was not a first world country. Mexico was the country of the third world that had gotten the Olympics for the first time. A week before the Olympics were set to open, 10,000 students and their supporters gathered in a public square in Mexico City, the Square of the Three Cultures in Tlatelolco. And they were fired upon by the army and by police. We do not know how many people died, but we know that between 50 and 700 students were killed that day. This is October 2nd, 1968. So the Mexican student movement was entirely repressed, and it fell apart after the massacre of Tlatelolco. But '68 was a watershed in Mexican history. With hindsight, we can say it was the beginning of the end for the one-party system, one-party political system in Mexico. It made clear to all the authoritarian dimension of this party, the PRI party. And finally, in the year 2000, 70 years after it had initially come to power, the PRI lost a presidential election for the first time, and Mexico became a multi-party system. So it's talked about as 2000 being a certain democratization of Mexico. The last really important student movement in Mexico was that of 1999 to 2000 at UNAM, the Universidad Autónoma Nacional de México. It is the largest university in Latin America. From what I've heard, it's the second largest university in the world. It has a student population of about 200,000. And this mobilization in 1999-2000 was around the demand for free tuition for all students. Again, the university was beginning to raise tuition to something like $50 a semester. Okay. And so the demand then was for a strong public university system supported by the government. This movement in 1999-2000 lasted for about a year, ended with police occupation of the campus, but it did succeed in its demands of minimal tuition. Okay, the final student movements I want to talk to you about today are the really exciting movements taking place right now in Colombia and in Chile. They are related to each other because both come out of the neoliberal tendencies in higher education that have been dominant in Latin America over the past 3 decades. Economic neoliberalism in Latin America has signified increasing privatization of higher education and the establishment of new for-profit universities. This signifies a lessening of government commitment to providing quality public education. Some of these for-profit universities are in countries like Brazil and Costa Rica, where only students from very well-to-do families who have attended private high schools manage to pass the entrance exams for admission to the public universities. Less privileged people end up in some small private colleges that are rather like community colleges or technical schools, offering practical courses of study, accounting, tourism, international commerce, which is regarded as a practical study. Chile is the extreme neoliberal case of Latin America. It's a country that since the military dictatorship of General Pinochet in the 1980s has experienced very rapid economic growth and extreme inequality. In Chile, public primary and high school education is so bad that if you graduate from a public high school, you have no chance of going to university. And you can't get into the public universities if you have a public high school degree. So only poor people go to public school. The middle classes shrimp and save to send their kids to private school, which are extremely expensive, so they'll have a chance at university. Education is an enormous expense in Chile. For the lower 3/5 of the population, sending a daughter or a son to university costs about 40% of the annual income of the family for a year. And so the result of this is that families who do manage to send their kids to university come out with humongous debts. So in Chile, where the cost of food or rent is less than in Canada, the cost of education and healthcare are much more expensive than here. Okay, so what has happened? Last April 2011, a very important student movement began in Santiago, Chile, that is amazing the world. There have hardly been any social movements in Chile since the military's dictatorship, which ended in 1990. People said that neoliberalism had made social organization almost impossible, but youth is leading the way. There is a generational shift. These students never experienced the dictatorship. They are demanding new things. The students began calling for an end to for-profit education. Then they started calling for a strengthening of public higher education. That is, the government must devote more resources to higher education because it is essential for democracy and essential for economic development. When the government did not respond, and the president of Chile right now is Pineda, who rescued the 33 Chilean miners a year ago. He's a billionaire kind of guy who's somewhat to the right of center. Students then, when the government did not respond, began elaborating a larger political analysis and developing proposals for societal change through education. And so in point of fact, in contrast to what Fred said about North America, I think education is central to grassroots movements in Latin America right now. Okay, so these students have attracted the support not only of their parents, who go out into the streets at night banging pots and pans to indicate their discontent with the government, but has also gathered the support of many other sectors of the population. Right now, it's estimated that 70% of the Chilean population supports the student movement. Meanwhile, President Pineda's approval ratings have dropped to 25%. The opposition political parties are down to 11% approval. So what it's saying is the government's handling of all of this has really led people to start questioning the political elite in Chile itself. Many people are saying that the rebirth of social movements in Chile in 2011 signifies, finally, the end of the Pinochet dictatorship, actually 20 years after Pinochet left power. Although formally there was a transition to democracy in 1990, Chile is still living under the constitution written by the military regime, and the economic policy of neoliberalism has been continued by the post-Pinochet governments. Now there are calls for a constituent assembly to write a new constitution in which the social movements may have a voice. In Chile, during the 8 months of protests since April, and this is ongoing, the government has called out the riot police and army tanks against demonstrators on the streets. They use tear gas a lot. They also call out tanks with water cannons, and sometimes they put the tear gas in the water cannons, which is not good. Right. It's hard to take. There's been 1 death and thousands of arrests. At the same time, students are developing creative new forms of protest, which are also new forms of communication with other Chileans. Let me turn to Colombia for a moment to explain some of the motives of these new protest forms. In Colombia, the student protests that are going on today also have to do with the impact of neoliberal policies. To symbolize the $1.8 billion a year that the protesters are demanding for Chile's public education. Crowds of Chilean students have also danced as zombies to Michael Jackson's Thriller. They've staged fake group suicides where they fall in a heap of bodies to signify the death of education. And both in Chile and Colombia, students have initiated kiss-a-thons, all right, besatones. These mass kiss-ins are a way of attracting public attention and winning acceptance for their struggle to defend public education. By kissing each other, you should see the videos of these things, they're on YouTube. The students show that they are not violent agents of social destabilization or guerrillas in disguise, but they're human beings, capable of love. So what happens is someone puts out the word on Facebook or Twitter saying, let's all go to the street and kiss each other for education. And boyfriends and girlfriends converge on the street and kiss each other. And people around them laugh. And then they explain their cause. They explain the cause of education. Sometimes they hug and kiss the police. And also there have been massive street demonstrations up to, well, beyond kiss-a-thons, okay. There have been mass street demonstrations, up to 200,000 people at a time in Santiago, Chile, so this includes more than students. There have been school takeovers, there have been hunger strikes, etc. Finally, in Colombia in the last couple of months, students have formed a new organization, the Broad National Student Table. And people in organizations of students who are all concerned with what's happening in the universities, but have different opinions, different perspectives on what is happening, have formed this organization, and it is to demonstrate and to form new spaces of discussion and deliberation, to gather information on what is happening at other universities around the country, and to plan forums and protests. I'm concluding now really fast. All right, a couple of the main perspectives coming out of Latin American student movements in the 21st century are, number one, obviously, and this is true in North and South America, neoliberalism and business have deeply affected university education over the past 2 to 3 decades in many different ways. One of the most important slogans of the Latin American student movements is education is not a commodity, is not a commodity, it is a right. And the idea is that public education is a form of social inclusion. It opens possibilities for mobility, for access, and for more egalitarian societies in societies that are tremendously unequal. Secondly, Latin American writers say, the university reflects the values and character of the society in which it is embedded, and the university also must influence and shape the larger society. If we are to have a democratic society, we must have a democratic university. Okay, so this is what's coming out of the Latin American student movement. Thank you.